All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, this is Jim Manker from the CSAC Finance Corporation. I am the Director of Business Development here and oversee our Corporate Associates program that has many experts in the field on a number of topics that we think are helpful for our county members. And so we're thankful that they're with us today. There's ZenCity. They've been with us almost a year now, and we have a couple of really excellent panelists today for you. They're going to introduce themselves in a minute. I want to give a shout out to all the counties that are with us today: Monterey, Tuolumne, Mendocino, El Dorado, Tulare, San Diego, and Riverside. It's great to have all you folks with us, and we're glad that you joined us today. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and partner at ZenCity, Eyal. Take it away for us, please.
Thanks so much, Jim. Real pleasure to be with you guys. And, we're really honored and privileged to be partners of CSAC. Some of you, we met at the CSAC conference that was just a little bit ago. And we're excited to present with you guys here today. I'll just share my screen so we get it. And as Jim was saying, it's going to be a bit interactive using the chat function at the bottom of your screen, as well as we can also use the Q&A, but we might use the chat function just because there's an intimate group of people, and it'll be a good way to just hear the other voices in the room. Just make sure, whoops, sorry about that. Into the end of it. So today we're gonna, today's webinar is really about how to talk about risk with your supervisors and your community in mind. And I'm Eyal Halamish. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Services at ZenCity. And in a moment, I'll go a little bit into what ZenCity is about in our agenda for today. But I just wanted to hand over to my colleague, Maurice, to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Eyal. My name is Maurice Classen. I'm a senior advisor at ZenCity. I work mostly with large cities and counties, as well as police departments. My immediate past position was as chief of staff for the mayor of the city of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, for about 2.5 years. So during COVID and a lot of the George Floyd uprising. And so clearly had a lot of risk to manage in that position. Prior to that, I did have a long career in county, or at least long for me, so about 10 years as a county prosecutor in King County in Seattle, Washington, before I moved to Chicago, where I spent about 5 years at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and then a year inside the Chicago Police Department, working on risk management issues, as well as managing our Chicago consent decree from the state over the Chicago Police Department. So really looking forward to the conversation. As y'all said, hoping that we can make it as interactive as possible.
Great, thanks so much, Maurice. And before we get into the topic, and we will share some examples of like how to think about risk with your community, how to think about risk with your community, and Maurice will share some examples from his experience in the Midwest. I just want to do a brief introduction of ZenCity. Some of you I know are ZenCity customers. Good to see you, Jeff. Good to see a few in the room. But just at a high level, for those who haven't gotten the background, ZenCity is really a community engagement platform that's used by cities and counties across the states. So you could see a beautiful picture of our team on an offsite there with our bright purple shirts. But the network, we're supporting about 300 cities and counties across the states. We're in 7 countries globally, and we've impacted about 130 million people through the technology that we provide, which is really about gauging community feedback and linking that directly into government decision making. And you could see some of the counties we're working with, both in California and beyond. And the network is really nationwide, and just in California alone, we're getting a good breadth across the state, and always looking to see how we can create more value for counties, so we can better understand resident feedback and see how that can input into different departments and different decisions that we're making. One of the main problems that we're trying to tackle is how to make the challenging life of managing a county actually easier. We're constantly being hit by different information from different sources, whether that be from residents, from the media, from other places. And a lot of times it's hard to measure what success looks like with regards to managing these different conversations, these different elements of county. And when we do go out and speak to different people in our community, we tend to hear from the same 10 people, that small group that are always inside, the boardroom. They're always there mouthing the same things over and over again. And so we've developed a set of tools that are going to go beyond that same 10 people. So how do we actually start to understand what the wider scope of people inside your community are thinking about, and how do we actually lower the bar for the community to participate and make it easier for county managers to use this data and take action on that data? We do that by collecting information from a range of sources, primarily organic input that's coming from the sources where people are already talking about the things that matter to them most, on social media, on 311 feeds. Well, we're also driving proactive input where we can deploy surveys, we can deploy active engagement solutions to ask people strategic questions about what we want to hear their feedback on. And we pump that into an AI-powered tool where we can analyze that information and provide you with high-level insights about where you might want to take the next set of actions. And as you can see, we've worked with some of the nation's leading experts in this space, including Professor Stephen Goldsmith from Harvard, former deputy mayor of New York City, who said that he's looked at a range of solutions throughout the years and has seen this as one of the best ways to actually identify key sentiment, key ideas that are coming from our communities, and how do we turn that into actionable insights over time. The counties that are using ZenCity are primarily using them for these 6 areas, whether it's about building community trust by better understanding what's the sentiment in the community and where are the areas where we can be improving our performance. Also around budgeting and resource allocation. Some counties are using it for ARPA allocations and figuring out how do we prioritize where to put the funding that we're getting from ARPA. Also performance management, how are we performing with regards to driving the communication, driving the messaging in our communities, and also getting ahead of the curve with regards to issues that our community cares about, so that we make sure that our policies, our positions, and our programs are on point with what our community expectations are. Also crisis management. Sometimes we've got things that are firing up in our communities, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this today, about like what happens when a crisis emerges. How do you identify it before it's too late? And also once it's in play, how do we respond to that effectively through our decisions and also through our communications? Infrastructure development, how do we make sure we're getting the right feedback when we're putting a big piece of infrastructure in place or revamping something or adjusting it? And something that's becoming more and more of an issue for counties across the states is addressing the dis and misinformation that's happening in our communities. Having other sources of information that are coming in, sharing that they're the expert on something when in fact it's very different than the information we may have inside our organizations. How do we address that, bring it to the fore, and make sure that our communities understand what we're really working on? It really, when you get into the platform, it really is about going from data to dashboard to insights. How do we actually collect that data, put it in a space where you can see in real time what's actually happening in your community, and then turn that into actionable insights that you can then take with your teams. Oh, I clicked straight through it. Sorry about that. Didn't realize it was hyperlinked there. And so that's just a brief insight. And at the end of this, we can have a chat. If you do want to hear more about the ZenCity platform, feel free to ping Jim or ourselves, and we can get you guys to get a deeper dive into what's involved there. But today's session is really about how to talk about risk with your supervisors in your community. And specifically, Maurice and I are coming from the consulting team inside ZenCity. We work with our clients to better understand what's the handheld support that we need in responding to key concerns and issues that are coming up in our communities. And so today we want to delve into what it means to talk about risk with our supervisors and our community. And so the agenda is we're going to do some introductions, and in a moment, we're going to use the chat function to really hear from you, your name, your organization, and also what are some of the key questions you have about talking about risk with your community. So if you want, you can start popping that in. And when we get to it, we'll also have a quick scan so we can get a feel for who's in the room and what kind of issues you want us to cover in the talk. We're also going to talk about why communicate risk and why this is important to be on the forefront when taking a risk communication approach. We'll talk about how do you actually understand outrage. And we'll give some examples of how City of Chicago understood that outrage and how they responded to it. We'll provide some risk communication strategies, and then we'll talk about next steps from here. And at the end of the session, if you do want to have a follow-up chat with Maurice or I about a specific issue you're working on, we're happy to jump on a call for a quick hour for that. So some introductions. I'd love it in the chat if you could pop in your name, your organization, and a question you have about the topic that you would like answered in this session. So feel free to chime it in. It may be something around a particular issue that you're addressing in your work. It may be something that's related to a general theme about risk, or maybe even around sentiment analysis and how do we understand what our communities are talking about. So I'll just pause for a moment to give you a chance to pop your name, your organization, and the questions about the topic. And there's just a few of us here, so if we could each throw that in there, that'd be great. Seeing a few pop in. I know we've got great Michael Workman. Thanks for that. From County of San Diego. No specific questions yet. That's all right. I'm sure ones will pop up as we go through. Any other questions that are popping through? Also, if you just want to introduce yourself, no need to throw in the questions. Otherwise, I'll leave it open. I'll leave the chat open as you guys stick them in, and we'll and just as the questions come through, we'll respond to them. But also just introducing yourself so others know that you're in the room. That'd be great. Hi, Jeff. Good to see you. County of Riverside.
Also remember, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can raise your hand and I will allow you to speak so you can ask your question live.
Great, thanks for that, Jim. And hi, Katrina from Tulare County. How to address conflicting values when discussing risk? Great question, and we'll allude to that a bit in our thinking about how risk comes up in our communities and also amongst our supervisors. I know it's a big issue when we've got conflicting values or conflicting political opinions about something where there's a lot of entrenched thinking about an issue. Awesome. Well, let's jump into it as the rest come in. Paresh Patel, Monterey County. Sounds like you had a really great introductory meeting with ZenCity team and no questions yet. Awesome. Great to see you, Paresh. So today we're going to talk first about, why communicate risk. And I want to hand over to Maurice to talk about an example that came up in the city of Chicago that will be a hook and a story that we're going to carry out throughout today's session. And we'll apply some theory around this as well, so we can break it into something that maybe applies to counties as well. So Maurice, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Eyal. And I do want to start with some recognition that this will be an example that's coming from a city, not a county. And we recognize, obviously, cities and counties face very different challenges. But also, I think that might help us in this example be able to sort of see from a distance how things are similar or different. And then also, this example will be from a policing setting, which is, of course, controversial. But I think it also helps us highlight even more significantly the risk that's involved, and also, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the value challenges that you have to frame. So, obviously, many of you work in large jurisdictions. Many of you work in large media environments. The city of Chicago is one of the largest media environments in the United States, and risk plays a part in all of the work that we did on a daily basis, whether that be political risk, that with our ability to actually move things forward with city council and the state legislature, legal risk, the sort of exposure that we faced from potential lawsuits and potential settlements, reputational risk, that around what the city's brand was, our ability to actually gather tourists or encourage tourism. And then obviously operational risk, the challenge to be able to execute on a daily basis, whether that be moving garbage, moving street cleaning, or being able to keep the city safe on a daily basis. All of those are risks that we had to balance on a daily basis. So I want to give an example of an incident, and we'll sort of just talk about sort of the groups that we had to work with. What we highlighted is sort of the potential risk challenges, and then y'all will kind of walk through a framework for us to talk it through, and then we'll come back to how it all landed, and then also maybe sort of open it up for some questions and see if we can explore from there. So y'all, can you move forward? All right. The incident I want to talk about is an incident from March of last year that many of you may have heard of because it did make the national news. It involved a police-involved shooting and death of a 13-year-old boy named Adam Toledo in the city of Chicago. In late March of 2021, which was just 2 months short of the one-year anniversary of the George Floyd protest in Chicago, a shot spotter alert occurred, an acoustic technology in a little village neighborhood in the city of Chicago, which is a majority Latinx neighborhood. The police responded very quickly to the acoustic technology. There had been a shooting earlier in the week where a young mother had actually been killed and some of her children were wounded in a shooting in a car. And so the police were particularly aware of what was going on in the neighborhood. When the police arrived, within about 45, 60 seconds, they saw two individuals running down an alley. They stopped. One of the individuals, police got out of their vehicle, they exited, they followed the two individuals. One stopped, the one kept going. Police officer attempted to apprehend him. That's Adam Toledo on the right, and he was shot as he turned and his hands were going up. the city of Chicago's video policy at that time related to police-involved shootings was a minimum of 60 days, a maximum of 90 days for release. But within 1 week, we knew, based upon neighborhood concern as well as protests that were potentially starting to brew, that we had a challenge that we wouldn't be able to allow the policy to hold true or hold firm for the full 60 days, lest we begin to lose control of the city. So we had to analyze the problem, look at all of the risk, and be able to make a series of determinations, both from a communications and operational perspective. Hey, y'all, keep forward. So laying out the risks. What we had before us was a complex video. Well, wherever you stood in the particular shooting, whether it was justified or not, it certainly was complex from a variety of perspectives. There wasn't a clear view one way or the other. There were multiple angles of the video, and there were videos from across the street, down the alley, and then actually the body-worn camera that was on the police officer. Second, we had the video policy. We said it was a standard within the city of Chicago. The video was not to be released until 60 days were up, and potentially 90 if an investigation was to continue to be ongoing. Third, who controlled the video? At this time, the city of Chicago has a civilian office of police accountability who was actually responsible for independently reviewing the video and choosing to release it or not. So it wasn't up to the mayor's office to be able to release the video, or the police department. Fourth, the independent investigatory body also had its own challenges in investigating the case, and they had their own communication group. Fifth, the CPD's history. As many of you probably know, the Chicago Police Department has a long history and challenged history, fraught history in the city as well as nationally with civil rights issues, and is currently under a consent decree from the Illinois Attorney General. Recent protests. As I mentioned, we were only 2 months short of the year anniversary of our George Floyd protest, and we'd had multiple shootings over the course of the past year, and there were concerns about ongoing protests, and protests were starting to grow within the city related to the Toledo shooting. Increasing violence. As many of you know, Chicago is faced with challenges regarding urban violence and handgun violence, and that was continuing to increase in the year 2021. Challenges with city council. The continuing challenge of police oversight and violence was causing fraught relationships between the mayor, our staff, and city council. So many, like you, when dealing with your supervisors, we had to deal with 50 city council members. Trust in local community, financial risk. Obviously, this was going to result in some sort of a lawsuit, how city law handled it. And then lastly, city staff morale. After a year of challenge from COVID, continued to face the challenge of continuing to motivate, whether that be police officers or city staff, to continue to be as engaged as possible in working. All right, next slide, Eyal. So lastly, before we move into a framework for how to analyze the problem, then we'll show you how it went in Chicago. We wanted to consider how we were going to communicate with folks. Beyond just city council, we also had the public writ large to communicate. We had neighborhood groups who were concerned about both safety and police-involved violence. City staff, as I mentioned, local and national media were making this a story. It covered on CNN. We had our own independent monitor, as I mentioned, from the police department related to the oversight. And then lastly, activist groups. So we had to challenge balancing communicating with all these groups, as well as focusing on our own governing body, the city council, and how we could communicate moving forward. So y'all.
So, I mean, really great example, Maurice, and thanks for sharing it. I know it's a really tense one, and I'm sure it's one that a lot of people on this webinar have faced or been close to before, where something pretty high risk happens in your community. Could be a shooting, could be another event, and suddenly you have to quickly map out the key stakeholders you have to communicate with. You have to think through what is the key messaging, what's our technical policy on the matter, what are some of the public sentiment or social issues that we have around that issue. So I just wanted to throw it out there. Feel free to pop this into the chat as well. Like, is there a situation, and you can be pretty high level about it rather than going to the detail, but is there a situation in the past where there was something similar or a high risk situation where you had to, there was some complication about it, something that was particularly jarring about the situation where we didn't have enough information, or there was a rising protest or social unrest around it? And also, what was the question that was top of mind for you here? So like Maurice, for yourselves, what was the question that was top of mind for you in this environment?
I think two things. One was being able to clearly be as transparent, right? I mean, almost like sort of a contradiction or a continuation in terms, right? So being as transparent as possible. The mayor's brand and part of what she ran on was on being as transparent as possible, while also recognizing, that sort of balance of transparency with that transparency causing potentially more conflict. So that was one great challenge. The second was making sure that we continue to sort of have a conversation around safety and ensuring, because the city, ultimately, at the end of the day, was sort of kind of teetering on control challenges because of both COVID, the rising violence, and some of the challenges we had coming out of the George Floyd protests. How do you balance that in sort of the transparency and the accountability pieces while still remaining safe? We had to manage protests in the middle of COVID, so allowing First Amendment frustrations or First Amendment expressions of frustration to occur in the city, while also recognizing we didn't want people to gather at significantly large numbers because of the potential for transmission of COVID. So it was both the balance of transparency and accountability with the piece on safety.
Yeah, brilliant. And you might see that a similar thing where things come up for you that are very technical elements of like, how do we keep people safe? And then also some of the more social elements about how do we build transparency or trust in brands. So if any examples from your own experience in your counties come to mind, feel free to pop in the chat so other people see some examples of where this comes up. But the key thing here is how do we actually understand the outrage or the growing outrage around this issue, right? And this is a really important piece where a lot of times we think about the risk to our county's reputation is primarily tied to our ability to deal with the hazard or the technical elements of this. So in this instance, the risk to the city of Chicago, the technical elements are like, will people gather? Will there be transmission of COVID? Will there be, was there a technical issue with the video being shared? Is there a technical issue here about our video policy? These are all technical policy matters that are happening inside. And we normally look at if we've handled the technical elements of this issue, therefore the risk is low. And we tend to apply this from a place of, if we've actually done what our policy says, then our risk should be low and the public should understand that level of risk. But the truth is that there's another side of this equation that we seldom think about, which is the outrage component, right? And it kind of comes and goes and we deal with it when it comes, but actually actively managing the outrage is a key part of managing risk. And in fact, hazard is the technical element or the expert perception of risk, while outrage is the public perception of risk, which sometimes can seem unruly or can get out of hand very quickly. And so in this environment, we're saying that although the hazard might have been medium or even low because we had a policy, it was just about how quickly we could release video footage, the outrage was likely to be very high. And so we have to actually manage the outrage in order to reduce the level of risk. Does that make sense? And Maurice, do you see that applying in this situation?
Yeah, and I think one thing that might be of interest and challenge here was challenging for us, it might be an interesting point for discussion is, when policies are outdated, right? So one could imagine, and this was one that had only been installed 5 years prior in response to the police involved shooting of Laquan McDonald. We thought it was actually something that was forward thinking. But unfortunately, the great challenge was like communities were advancing in a faster stage than the public policy was. So we were following the policy that we had outlaid. And so we weren't doing anything that was unjust or illegal or sort of not following what government had said it would do. We have a huge challenge in the fact that like that policy wasn't meeting what the public needed. And so balancing those two pieces can be a challenge because you're doing what you think is right from a procedural justice perspective. You're following your law or following your regulations, but that might not be enough for the community based upon what they were expecting to have happen in sort of the current state of times.
And it's a great point because what people don't realize is that sometimes outrage and hazard actually have little correlation in causing risk. So you can have something that's really high outrage and low hazard, and you can have high risk to your organization or what you're trying to do. Or you can have something that's high hazard and low outrage and still have high risk, So in this situation, we had actually a low hazard, but a high outrage, a high likelihood, and therefore there was a risk to CPD's reputation, versus sometimes there may be something where it's highly hazardous, but no one actually cares about it. It's still a risk to your reputation as an organization. And so we're constantly needing to balance that understanding. And the way to really dive deep into what is the distinction between hazard and outrage here is to see hazard as the expert assessment of risk. It tends to be a lot of the accountants, the engineers, the scientists that are sitting inside our counties that are doing a lot of this work, and they may have an expert assessment of what's right and what's wrong here versus the public assessment of risk can be quite different. So from an expert perspective, it might be scientific. There might be a ratio or statistically, here's why we have this policy in place. Well, the public assessment of risk is very intuitive. It's how they feel about the particular thing. Does it feel right? Or is it probabilistic versus yes or no? Well, government tends to present a set of statistics or the probability of this happening again. The public want to know, will this happen again? Yes or no? And is there something in place to make sure it doesn't happen again? We also talk about acceptable levels of risk versus is it safe? Or is there a changing and evolving knowledge around this like we've seen around the COVID environment where, is it or is it not going to hurt people? Do we or do we not have this solved? a lot of times in our expert perception, we talk about comparative risk versus discrete events like this one, where we had a specific shooting. It's a discrete event. There's a person attached to this. We want to know what's going to happen with everyone who was around this particular situation, rather than actually this is one of many shootings that are happening in Chicago, and compared to a wider set of statistics, this is just one of many incidences, right? Also, there's the personal consequences, which is the public assessment, versus the averages of what's happening across our counties. And finally, there's like a death is a death. So, from an expert perspective, through to like, it matters how we die. Like, why should someone have been, shot and this happened to them in this instance? And you can see how these different levels of assessment can actually be different takes on what happened at play, which can sometimes make it difficult to communicate risk. So when you think about the moment that, inside, maybe thinking about how does hazard and outrage apply, particularly in some of the moments that you've had in your organization. If you do want to pop them in the chat, feel free. But I just posed the question, more of a rhetoric. So, how does this apply to your risk communication moment? And where do you see outrage being a key factor? And what do you see hazard being a key factor? So I'll go into some of the outrage factors. And if we do want to, because we have a good grasp on hazard, outrage is really one of the more complex spaces. And a lot of times we think that that outrage is a really difficult thing to understand, but actually you can predict and understand outrage better than some of the technical things that you can understand inside your organization. And in fact, we understand people better than we understand some of the engineering operations or some of the policies that we have inside our organization if we just put our lens onto it. And the hazard outrage dynamic comes from a PhD at Princeton, Dr. Peter Sandman, who actually broke outrage down into 12 factors. And he said that if you could actually sit with a particular moment, you can start to diagnose the different outrage factors that are driving the conversation or the public sentiment around this issue. And so the 12 factors are here on the graph. I'll just point out to a few of them just so we can understand, one of the main drivers of public outrage tends to be control. If citizens feel like they don't have control over a situation, for example, this shooting happened by the police and there was no control about, an oversight committee, or there's no way to actually be involved. If there's a lack of control, if we feel like someone else has that control, outrage tends to increase, right? And one of the ways we adapt or mitigate the outrage factor of control is we actually start to share control. We invite people into the conversation and say, here are some options or ways we can actually resolve this particular issue. And by sharing that control, we actually start to mitigate that level of outrage. Or fairness is another example of outrage, where people might think that the process by which something is done is unfair. Therefore, they're outraged. So the way in which we went about it was unfair. So maybe the policies are in misalignment, or the way we led it. And also there's a second part of fairness, which is the outcome is unfair. So the process may have been fair, but the outcome and the result wasn't fair, right? And so in those instances, you want to really be able to diagnose what is the level of is it the process or is it the outcome? And based on that, then you can actually discuss with key stakeholders about what would be perceived as a fair process, and therefore delving into that in order to mitigate the outrage, right? Some of the other ones here about how responsive we are to people. Are we quick to respond, or do we wait, or do we go into investigation and actually wait to come back with information? In this instance, a great example of if the video policy was 60 to 90 days, the public might perceive that as an unresponsive government. We're waiting too long to release this footage, and therefore outrage increases, right? Versus we're going to change our policy because we know that there's going to be outrage about this, so we're going to actually release that footage much sooner. Another one to share about uncertainty is that sometimes if there's different people in the public talking about this issue, such as if the mayor and the city manager and the chief of staff and the police chief have different messages out in the public about what happened, there's varying levels of certainty, and there's different experts in the community talking about what happened. Therefore, outrage increases because there's no certainty. Similarly, we've seen this in the COVID environment, where you've got different PhDs, different scientists, different health organizations communicating what is and isn't happening out in the community in response to COVID. And therefore, there's high levels of uncertainty, and you can see the levels of outrage that have increased across the nation as a result of that.
Eyal, can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah, please.
I think it's kind of interesting, this framework, when you started to show it to me, like there's not things that I naturally had, or I didn't have this framework in front of me at the time, but these were the things that were actually, many of these were what were driving a lot of our thinking about how to quell folks' outreach in the community about this event. I mean, the trust piece, you'll see this later when we talk about what the result was, but what the relationship was with the family and the neighborhood in which this occurred. Fairness, leaving people with the perspective that, like, whether or not, this particular outcome, a young man dying, was a good thing or a fair thing, which obviously clearly it was not. how could we, in our accountability structure, be able to ensure that how it would be dealt with in a fair way? And then responsiveness, the idea to the point about the video release policy, the culture changes, right? And that 5 years ago, we thought we were ahead of the game or ahead of policy, or ahead of the nation's sort of positions on this, and releasing a video within 60 days of an incident, or even 90 at the worst case. Now it's getting to the point where like it takes a week or two before like communities really get upset and want that video out, and sort of being able to say, hey, we're responsive to what the community's interests are as long as the investigation is protected. So while these things, this sort of framework wasn't in my mind, all of these things were things that were front of mind as we were thinking and working our way through the problem.
Awesome. And so as you can tell, even in reflecting on that framework, this applies best when you look at a specific incident and you think, what are the factors that directly apply to this incident? Is it control? Is it trust? Is it fairness? And if we can specifically diagnose that that's the issue that's driving the outrage, then we can come up with a solution or response that's going to be appropriate inside the organization. And so as you think about the incidences that are happening in your counties, maybe you could reflect on which factor do you think came up during your risk communication moment, or which came up when you were actually reflecting on a crisis that you've had to communicate in the past. And is there one of these, 12 outrage factors that was driving that, and as an offer, we can actually delve deeper into that to really get precise around what was the outrage factor driving that. And therefore that informs a whole set of strategies in how you address that outrage and manage the risk to your organization. So I want to hand it back over to Maurice to talk about how do these outrage factors apply, and therefore what was the result with this particular incident.
Yeah, well, thanks, Eyal. I think I've talked a little bit about how some of those sort of concepts framed our response and what we were doing in terms of how we would think about this. But I think if we had to categorize it into what the types of responses were, I'd start with the trust component. And part of what we saw was we knew that in order to be able to make sure that we were rebuilding trust with community, much of which had been lost during the previous administration's experience of police-involved shootings, folks knew that police-involved shootings would occur, no matter how tragic they are. There's sort of a sense that they are going to occur over the course of time. It's how you deal with them. So we developed a very tight relationship with the neighborhood. We had a lot of trusted community actors or community leaders who we'd worked with. So we worked hand in glove with them, as well as with the family of Adam Toledo themselves. So we actually spent a lot of time, put sort of money into the trust bank, or activity into the trust bank. We did several sort of listening sessions, community tables with folks. The picture in the upper left there is with one of the community leaders, Raimundo, who was involved in one of the press conferences we had when we were calling for peace following the release of the video. So the first sort of element of this was building trust, being close with family, and being close with trusted community leaders. Second was being very focused on sort of working in small groups, right? Not just simply communicating via press release or communicating via television, going literally group by group, focus group by focus group, interest group by interest group, and meeting with them with our staff. So we literally broke apart with our staff a series of groups, and we focused, for example, as this relates to county supervisors, we literally met in groups of 5 with, to make sure we didn't violate any Open Meetings Act regulations, groups of 5 with aldermanic leaders, and walked through what the video would show, walked through what the reaction we expected to be, walked through how we were planning on protecting safety, and walk through what our communication strategy was. So, small groups, not just large groups, not just communicating from the dais, but communicating in a very focused way in social networks. And the third big bucket, and I think this is probably most important in some ways, was being responsive, right? We saw that within the outrage group. It was the outrage framework. And for us to be responsive, we wanted to make changes in policy. So we made a specific policy change to the video release policy and said, look, we're going to start releasing these faster. We hear the community. We understand that these are critical pieces of things that they want to see. As long as the investigation is protected, we're going to release them earlier. So we made a policy change around that. We made policy changes and analysis around our foot pursuit policy, which was something that led to the actual shooting. So how officers make determinations on whether or not they should follow individuals, what level of crime that they should be following. And then there were some policy changes also around transparency and investigation techniques. And so getting ahead by being responsive to the policy concern as well. And then we understood that when we released the video itself, this is sort of an interesting one and something worth talking about. A lot of times people will say, at least in my old trial practice, the evidence speaks for itself, but in a lot of ways it doesn't, right? Because there isn't the context of the video. And so being able to provide some context to the video, exactly the angles at which things were occurring, and being able to sort of present it in a way in which community members and communications folks, so the media, could actually consume it. Ultimately, I think we ended up in as much of a difficult situation. It was a pretty good shape. There were only a small amount of protests. They were all safe. They were all peaceful. Community groups seemed to be happy with how government responded to the concern. The investigation was seen as fair. It's actually still ongoing within the county, and the county's making its determination of whether or not there should be criminal charges. And then we, were able to pass a series of those proposed legislative changes, which I think also gave people an outlet. So ultimately, I think that there was a lot of success. 2 points that I think are worth raising here is that, in the what next section, one is, this isn't over. As it's now in the county's hands, there's this great challenge between, as all of you know, the jurisdictional battle in communications challenges and risk challenges. Some of the stuff the city is responsible for, some is the county. And so that is sort of an issue that remains out there. The second is just sort of raising a point about execution. When the video was released, there was a video that was just purely the video with no context that was released by the investigative body. And then there was a video that was released by the police department, which provided a little bit more context. And because the police department was just slow in getting their video out, they were actually an hour behind the investigatory body. It was very interesting to watch how the narrative became something that was driven solely by the video without the context. Had I think the other video gotten out at the same time, I think there kind of would have been a little bit more debate, but just showing how today's media markets move so quickly that if you're even 15, 20, and 60 minutes late, you can lose the story and you can lose the narrative. So that's just something to consider as well.
And just Maurice, and if you, as Jim noted, if there are any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat or into the Q&A. I'm just curious, based on what you were sharing, Maurice, you noted a few of the key outrage factors that stood out here. Are there ones that you think were the strongest? I heard a bit of fairness and certainty, maybe also a bit of responsiveness. Were those like your top three?
I think that's up there. I think there's also a little bit of this, catastrophic potential that played a role in this. Is sort of the sense that, like, when we had the protest around George Floyd, and then there was another police-involved shooting over the summer that led to more rioting, there was a lot of concern in community about what the potential outrage could do to safety. And so I think there was sort of a catastrophic perspective. So being able, to have community leaders, flip that on its head and then use that as a way of saying, okay, well, if we're calling for calm, if we're calling for peace, that's a way of getting people to sort of see this issue all the way through and contemplate and talk about it in different ways and be more productive. And so I thought that actually, while that was leading, some of the outrage, it also helped quell some of the outrage, because people, certainly some of the community members who cared the most about sort of violence, were able to use that as a way of getting people to think more thoroughly about the issue and have longer conversations about it, and not simply protest or simply sort of get out in the streets and potentially be violent.
Yeah. And it sounds like one of the biggest one was about being hyper responsive here. So like getting out there, actively addressing the issue as soon as possible, not even waiting for some of the policy matters, started to mitigate the outrage, as well as with the communication of fairness. We want to make sure we get this right, bringing in key community leaders that will help actualize or understand what a fair process is here, what a fair outcome is here. And also from a certainty perspective, bringing the different people into the tent, right? Those are all strategies that you can use to mitigate the outrage that were applied in this particular environment.
Yeah, one other thing I'd just like to add on this, we actually did too, and this is something I would recommend for folks, we really mapped out, the mayor was very strong about this, even from the beginning of administration, mapping out who all the community groups are, who are all the political stakeholders, who are all the legal stakeholders, who are all the city employee stakeholders. So we would literally have a cabinet meeting followed by a staff, sort of senior staff meeting, followed by community group meeting, followed by activist meeting, followed by religious meeting. We literally do this over the course of a weekend. Before something was released on a Monday, we'd have 20 of these meetings. We'd just be going, pounding through all of them. But it was as scientific as you could kind of be. It was really just like, we got to hit each of these groups. We got to hit each of these social networks. We got to have the same talking points, and we have to be able to arm them with materials to be able to go out and make the case about what we're trying to say, and sort of how we're being fair, how we're being responsive, how we're trying to build trust.
Awesome. Really great stuff. So I want to talk about two strategies that can be applied here. One of which is more the traditional model, and it's probably not what was applied in this scenario, which I call it the DAD model, which is the decide, announce, defend. We've come up with a position, we decide we're going to take a certain stand in it, we announce it to the public, and then we kind of put up our boxing gloves and get prepared to defend what our policy announcement is. We're waiting for the same 10 people to come at us as to why what we've done is wrong. Or we might also be having a larger breakout where a larger swarm of the community is actually coming out and wanting to challenge or refine what we're coming out with. And a lot of times we're seeing that the DAD model actually tends to increase outrage because we're very much sticking to the hazard or the technical analysis of what's going on. Like, we played by the policy, we did what we could, therefore, you should be satisfied with our performance. But actually, we've seen that doesn't necessarily deliver the results that we want from a reputation and a risk communication perspective. And the second model is really a Dave model, which is where we're declaring a new direction of what we're trying to do here. We'll acknowledge any prior misbehaviors and mistakes. And this is probably the most challenging part of this model, is actually getting, senior executives, getting political leaders to acknowledge anything that didn't work or anything that we haven't gotten right in the past. So in the Chicago PD example, there is a level of acknowledging CPD's history, the Chicago Police Department's history, and that there are things that we've done in the past that haven't worked. And that really starts to mitigate that outrage and show that, us as a county, us as a city are prepared to figure out where the gaps are and set a vision for the future and put an evaluation in place with support from our critics. So a lot of times we see this as setting a vision for where we want to go, but also building a community reference group or building a group of stakeholders around the vision who can then tell us how we're performing over time. And that starts to address the outrage really, really effectively. Now, shifting from that DAD to Dave model it's simple on a slide, but it's actually quite complicated when you start to think about that from an organizational perspective, and you start to think about what that means from a public perspective. So just to give you an example of how these two strategies could play out, initially when something comes up, people might be upset with your performance. So in this instance, you had Chicago PD went out and there was an instance where people were upset and seeing this as another example of Chicago PD, going out of line with public expectation. And at first, what could have happened is that they might investigate and release information to stakeholders in the media. And once people discover this as activists, the media story grows really quickly and they start to pick angles of how they think this actually played out. We may actually deny some of the allegations from our activist groups and claim that they're actually not true. Over time, people might publicly shame us, and perhaps there might be some things that we share publicly that weren't true. And as a result, we have to back down into demands and actually just comply with where we're going. And as you can see, outrage has increased over time, right? This is very much the DAD model, where we've decided what we're going to do, we announce it, and then we defend it publicly, and we see how outrage increases over time. Versus one of the other scenarios is where if you apply the Dave model, you acknowledge concerns and explain the dilemma and apologize. And you commit to a performance improvement and show practical next steps. So you actually say, well, here's what we're going to do to address this in the future. And we're going to involve key stakeholders in this and actually have them evaluate our performance against the vision that we're set, which is really, really important so that people seeing third-party endorsement of what we're looking to do as an organization. Does that align, Maurice, with some of the stuff that you saw in Chicago?
Yeah, no, for certainly. I think, not just this incident, but many other incidents where I think if you're sort of in the defensive crouch, I think a lot about some of the other police involved incidents in which we had where you get a little bit more defensive and it suddenly just gets ratcheted up higher and higher. But the more you're sort of acknowledging what's happening and figuring out that roadmap to address concern, this way of focusing on that policy, sort of platform, what are the 6 steps we're taking? I think that actually has a tendency to quell folks.
Right. I'm curious, just opening it to the crowd, are there any questions that are coming up just about this case study, this example, and also the two models that we're talking about here, which is the DAD to Dave model? If not, I'll just keep going. I was wanted to ask if there for yourselves, hearing these model, how have you seen things like this play out in your community or even with your supervisors, where you're actually trying to communicate something and perhaps there's some outrage factors that are triggered, or you're seeing some knockback? If you do have any examples, feel free to pop them into the chat, or if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I do think it's, I'm just curious for you, Maurice, when you did do the Dad to Dave experience, what are some of the outcomes that you've seen as a result of that moving forward? Like, were there community reference groups? You said that there were some protests in place. Like, how did that play out compared to previous protests that came out around these particular incidents?
Yeah, so the two protests that we had were much less sort of expansive and violent. Like, they tended to be much, because people knew that we were going to protect folks' rights to be able to just go around and protest and express their First Amendment concerns. I think folks understood that they would get in large groups, but they'd be very sort of willing to partner with folks and be able to say, here's the direction we're going, here's how we're going there. I think one thing I really want to focus on, to your point, Eyal, is about what the sort of muscle memory is that you build up when you have a little bit more of the latter approach rather than the dad approach, the Dave approach rather than the dad approach, which is, I think, that you build a structure by which you get used to going out and doing this. In other words, I think it's very easy for us to sort of say, well, Dave, not dad, but like, don't get defensive. But the problem is you have the muscle memory that's been built up over time. And part of that muscle memory comes from, who are your groups? What's the roadmap for how you traditionally do this? What do people come to expect from you, right? So I'm sure a lot of your sort of supervisors, commissioners, in our perspective, it was city council members, once they kind of came to know that they were going to get communicated with, that they were going to get something within a day or two, that it would either be a phone call, a presentation. Once they knew those things were coming, it was easier for them to be able to have the muscle memory to say, when community groups came to them, hey, what's going on? Oh, well, I know I get information in this, and this way. Or if I'm a community group that's constantly informed in these Saturday sessions or Sunday sessions, when something controversial happens, I know that that's what I'm doing, and that's how I know I'm getting information, and I know that the city's not hiding anything. So that muscle memory also becomes how you can kind of continue to sort of get yourself out of the dad mode and into the Dave mode, because you're just used to doing it.
Brilliant. And another question, Maurice, Katrina asked before about how do you address conflicting values when discussing risk? Like, did you see conflicting values either from your council members or from people in the community when you were talking about this that you had to address? And how did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why I picked is as controversial as it is. That's why I picked a police-involved shooting, because they can be so controversial, and you're going to have a lot of value structure or value concerns, and certainly in today's sort of media environment and sort of where we are in terms of police reform and also just conversations around safety, these issues continue to pop up and people kind of fit in camps. And so I think one of the ways to deal with that is to highlight the value structure that you do align with. So to what we were talking about earlier, y'all, you've really got to say, okay, here's what we're going to do with transparency. Here's what we're going to do with accountability. Here's what we're going to do about process change, so that folks see that there are things on which they are aligned, right? And I think the mayor was actually very good at this, and I'm sure a lot of your elected leaders are good at this as well, but like, this is sort of the best advice of electeds, is when they can identify, hey, there are going to be some things that we're going to disagree on, and we may have conflict about that. And that's part of what our communities do well in sort of the states, is we have sort of, democracy allows a difference of opinions, and we got to go into the public arena and debate them. But here are the 6-7 things that we do agree on to get us to a common frame of reference, which sort of, I think, has a tendency to quell things. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. It's not simple, right? Like, there's still going to be chances where that conflict, and we've seen this, all over our political dialogue, can become challenging and if not violent. But the more you focus on the values that you do have aligned, I think you can get yourself out of these situations.
Yeah, I think, getting that, especially when a risk or a crisis is emerging, getting clarity around what are the values that we have at a higher level, but also being able to have a set of strategies to respond to those and make sure we're aligned with them. And also being able to diagnose publicly what are some of the key outrage factors we're likely to see. So the marrying of our values, our strategies, and also where are the key things that are coming from community. I think it's a bit of the proactive and the reactive combined together in order to address it. So Katrina, you mentioned the fires and COVID happening simultaneously. Both are public health and safety disasters. The complication being that the public had opposing responses to government mandates. Safety mandates were accepted in relation to the fire, but there was a great deal of pushback regarding COVID mandates. Trust and familiarity were likely outrage factors we didn't anticipate. How could we have applied the Dave model with COVID?
Come on, Katrina, that's an easy question. No, I mean, I think that's one of the great challenges, right? Like what I saw in my 2.5 years as chief of staff, and I think, kudos to everyone on this call who are still involved in government and, excuse the pun, but kind of firefighting on a daily basis, is that we now have so many things coming at you from so many different angles with COVID. The ability to balance it all and be able to state what your value structures are and be able to get consistent movement from your populace is a huge challenge, because there's, just a pure bandwidth tax for your operations staff. There's bandwidth tax for your comm staff. There's just exhaustion overall on community engagement and communications in general. People are just frustrated and exhausted after 2 years of this stuff. Government becomes much harder to execute on. But I do have a couple of thoughts on this. I've stammered on for a moment, so why don't I defer to you, and then I'll come back, because I do have one or two thoughts on this particular question.
Yeah, I think, Katrina, it's a really great example, and it's a really great question as well about how do you apply the Dave. I think, seldom do we realize how powerful and how valuable it is to acknowledge when we don't have it fully sorted out. And it's quite hard, especially inside government circles, to come out to the public and say, we know we haven't always gotten this right, or we know we haven't got this perfect, but we're going to go through this, work through this together. We're going to put something forward about how we want to achieve this, and we're going to work in partnership with you. So even on the with regards to public health and also with safety disasters, it's acknowledging any memory that people have about previous public safety issues or previous, public health issues in the past, where there may be moments in your community where you said, hey, we know we didn't get this right in X moments. Now we're going to try to do something a bit different. And I think that's a pretty powerful way to start to reframe and start to be able to bought into, okay, it's not just government speak. It's not just the same old defensive approach, but it's actually an acknowledgement that something isn't there and there's room for growth there.
And I think it's spot on, Eyal. The thing I would add on to that, Katrina, is that showing how you've grown, right? Like how government has continued to improve. This point I was making earlier about like the sort of community engagement groups that we had, or the ways in which we communicated with council. I think showing, hey, here's what we learned from the last time. Here's how we grew. Here's what we heard from you. Like we heard, like there's, we're not going to get an alignment, I think, now on a lot of stuff about COVID, but at least trying to move the needle in a percentage way to show some progress, finding, what worked from the fire situation and aligning on those pieces and adding them where you can in COVID, and saying, okay, look, this worked, or, this didn't. We heard you. We heard your concern. Community trust in government is one of the great challenges of today, like legitimacy of government. But what you can do is at least show sustained progress. And that, I think, it tends to get you more trust and familiarity.
I'm going to just bring us to a close, but on that one, Katrina, first of all, I really appreciate the question. And, as we all know, it's a big issue. And so if you do want to delve deeper into it, we can jump on a call. Maurice and I are always happy to delve deeper and support, people in the industry, especially when it's dealing with crisis and risk situations. And so I'll mention that just after this, but a quick recap of what we went through in today's webinar. Initially, we talked about why communicate risk and really identifying what the situation is, what the complication is, and what's the question that's top of mind for us, so that we know what the different angles around that risk communication are going to be. And then when you start to go one level deeper, actually understanding what the outrage is, and the fact that it's not just the technical or the expert perception of risk, but actually the public perception of risk that can trigger our reputation risk as an organization, or actually can limit our ability to operate. And there's 12 factors that actually drive outrage. And you can actually predict and understand and respond to outrage really effectively if you understand those 12 factors and you can diagnose what's happening in your community. And once you're in that position, actually having a risk communication strategy that isn't the decide, announce, defend model, but actually one where you're declaring a new direction, you're acknowledging any prior misbehaviors or mistakes, you're setting a vision for where we're going next, and building an evaluation mechanism either through a community reference group or a set of trusted messengers or a set of people in your community who can evaluate how we're performing against that vision. We just had a few questions, but as I mentioned, Maurice and I are happy to jump on a 1-hour call. We'll send you guys a follow-up email for that as well. If you want to book in a time, we can really dive deeper into one of the issues that's happening in your communities and see if there's any value we can create for you guys. It's completely just us wanting to apply our experience in this industry and make sure we can create value for you guys. And I just wanted to, and also if you are interested in learning more about the ZenCity solution, we're also happy to jump on a call or set up a time for show you a bigger demo of, how the platform works, how our survey functions work, how we've actually thought through these different ways. But I'll pause there in the last few minutes if there's any final questions. think we did a good job, Maurice. No questions.
That's right. That's right. No, and then I guess the last thing I would say is like you beyond just sort of being able to offer like our sort of willingness to chat. There are some ways in which the ZenCity tools I think we found very effective in Chicago to be able to help us analyze whether or not our strategies were working. But regardless, there's lots of ways that we can talk through with you, sort of challenges that you're facing in your own communities and ways in which our experience might be able to be helpful.
Excellent. Well, without further ado, it's 2 minutes to the top of the hour. Again, I want to thank our panelists, Eyal and Maurice. Thanks, you guys, for your expertise and your time today. Again, thanks ZenCity for your partnership with CSAC and California counties. We really appreciate you and love the energy and the expertise you bring to the table. This will conclude our webinar, and we will make a recording of this webinar available to all of our attendees and also the slide deck as well. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.
Great. Thanks, guys.